we're constantly filling in the blanks to keep ourselves protected, but we're not really experiencing reality in the present moment. We're experiencing the world through the lenses of our past. And if your past is okay, it's not so bad, some distortions. If your past is pretty bad, there's a lot of distortions that you're living your life through.
Dr. Anderson is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and psychotherapist. He is the author of Transcending Trauma and co-author of Internal Family Systems Skills Training Manual. And now he speaks and really has gone deep into trauma, dissociation, and now more around our upbringing. And with his latest book, To Be Loved, A Story of Truth, Trauma, and Transformation. How would you define and communicate attachment trauma?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. So I keep expanding and evolving on my definition. Like, that's one thing that is, like, as the world gets more cognizant of the different types of trauma, I'm always expanding what are the different types of trauma, family generational trauma, systemic trauma, global trauma, individual complex relational trauma, single event trauma. So there's different types of trauma, right? All traumas are not created equal, I like to say. And I think about, I used to think about intensity, frequency, and duration when I would think about trauma, like it's some overwhelming event or series of events. And I want to think about the intensity, the frequency, and the duration, because they have different effects on people depending on all those things. I also think about the perception or the experience of the individual, because there is this variability amongst overwhelming life experiences. And one person can encode it in one way and perceive it in a certain way that's very different than somebody else. I did this research study when I was in my residency training program, and we worked with teenagers that were hospitalized. And it was shocking that the kids that were in these upwardly mobile communities in Boston area had much more significant PTSD than the kids who grew up in like gangs and these kind of rougher neighborhoods, because it was so normalized for them. Like, this is our life. This is what we do. And we help each other and we go through it together, and they have less PTSD. So, this idea of perception is an important one. But I do think about trauma as what happens to you, what experience happens to you, because I think of trauma, I think about trauma energy, right? Trauma energy is something we absorb that is not ours. Is a subset of complex PTSD. It's a subset of relational trauma, and it's that really early relational trauma, right? The first couple years of life, which most people aren't aware of as significant, because partly it's pre-verbal. We don't encode it with language and memory in the same way, because our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex is not quite developed, and our language centers are not developed. So we can't really articulate it, even though we absorb it, we feel it in our bodies, we feel it in our emotions. So it has a profound effect on a lot of people with a lack of awareness. And most people aren't aware that their adult relationship struggles are rooted in attachment wounding. Most people don't even have that awareness because it's largely unconscious, because we're so young and we don't have words to articulate it.
And yet that doesn't stop the development of parts of us.
Yeah.
So tell us more about the parts that really come out of this experience of not having enough of what we needed in those early relational dynamics to feel loved.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. The way that IFS, Internal Family Systems, holds this concept is that we're all born with parts. We all have them. They're normal aspects of our personality. It's when we move through difficult moments when we move through challenging experiences, relationally, physically, emotionally, that our parts show up to try to protect us. So parts will take on roles of protection, or parts will take on the energy of the trauma. So some parts hold the pain, and some parts are like soldiers stepping up to battle. All right, I'm gonna push people away so I'll never get hurt again. Or I'm gonna eat to soothe in replace of love. Or I'm gonna drink, so that I can get some calm because I feel so overwhelmed inside. So parts of us, and they're young typically, will take on these extreme roles to protect us. And culture and society tends to not like those parts. Insurance companies don't like those parts. But it is important to understand that they're serving a role of protection from this internal pain.
How can it actually feel unsafe to feel connected? How can it feel unsafe to be vulnerable? How can it feel unsafe for some of these things to feel joy, to be able to play?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Jaak Panksepp, who's a well-known neuroscientist who subsequently passed, talked about play being the most underutilized emotion in psychotherapy, right? And I love that. He's like, we therapists are not using play enough here because it's such an important part of healing. And so I love that, awareness of his. There is a lot of ways that closeness, pleasure, joy, feeling good is dangerous, is threatening. And sometimes it's because parts of us that hold so much pain, shame, and loneliness cannot relate. It's like, this is foreign. Like, this doesn't fit here. Like, there's no match here, right? So our wounded parts cannot receive it, cannot take it in, because they have no frame of reference for it. So sometimes it's a mismatch. So it doesn't get received. Other times it's I was feeling love before I got violated. I was sharing my authentic self when I got hit, right? So sometimes it's the association for children, which are very cause and effect related. So every time I let my guard down is when I would get abused. Vulnerability is you connecting to and sharing your authenticity. Like, I feel this way. I love this. This is what feels right to me. Like, we're sharing our authentic beliefs, feelings, and thoughts. It's the reaction of the other person that's the problem. And people always confuse that. It's what you might say to my authentic statement that then I internalize, right? And so when people think vulnerability is a problem, I'm like, no, it's a superpower. It's who you are. It's the world or your father or the kids on the playground that had a reaction and a problem with your authentic self. And so I help to differentiate the distortion of, oh, I'm bad and wrong, versus that was wrong for them to say that, or parents shouldn't talk to their kids that way, or hitting a child is never a good idea, So to give responsibility where it belongs instead of taking it personally, which kids do all the time.
I love how you're really bringing in this neuroscience principle that what is familiar feels safe.
Yes.
And even if that familiar is unhealthy, it's familiar. And so I know how to predict what's going to happen. And when I'm coming out of my early years, and that's been how I survived, was to be able to predict what I should do and could do in order to get my needs met, then our muscle memory, if you want to call it that, or our nervous system is wired to go back to feeling that what is familiar is safe. And we see this played out in so many different ways. I'm sure this has been so many different clients over the years for you, where We stay in, for example, we stay in bad relationships. Why? Because it's familiar.
When we're seeking, we tend to repeat because it's familiar, but we're also seeking redemption. It's like, oh, maybe this relationship will be healing. Maybe this guy will be safer. Maybe this woman, because the familiar is they have some of the characteristics, but they're better. They're going to love me. They're going to be all I needed. So we throw on this hope with the familiar, and it's in the hopes of healing our wounds. Like it's in the hopes of healing our wounds, which is well intended. It just doesn't work, which is a real bummer. Other people can't be the mother and father we never had. Trauma blocks love, and love heals trauma. Trauma blocks who we are. Trauma blocks our authentic self. Trauma blocks our ability to connect with other people. So it's like trauma is this barrier, that blocks our essence, right? And through the work that I do as a therapist and my own personal healing journey, it's like, and it is love and connection that heals trauma. So it was like this cycle, and people resonate with it because I think it comes from a higher place that people relate and identify with it, right? And that has really been my experience, and it's been a lot of other people's experience also, which is kind of that universality of what trauma does to us and how we can ultimately heal it.